I've had countless paranormal and spiritual experiences as a kid, but this one has always stuck with me. 13 years ago, when I was around 6 or 7 years old, my mom, older sister, our little puppy, and I were living in my mom's boyfriend's apartment. The apartment had 3 rooms. The room on the far left was my sister's and mine. The room on the far right belonged to my mom and her boyfriend, and the one room in the middle was what we called the middle room. We were told not to go into the middle room because it was boyfriend's mom's room or whatever, but I still sort of remember her. She was very tall and slender, standing at least 6 feet tall. She looked to be in her 70s with gray sort of crinkly hair. We didn't see her leave the middle room much, but when she did, she would play games with my sister and me. At first, it was fun and my older sister seemed to love her, but then I would get a dreadful sort of uncomfortable feeling around her. So I tried to avoid her as much as I could. I think she noticed this too, because she started treating me differently, pinching me when no one was looking, pulling my hair and scratching me. Whenever I told my mother, she wouldn't believe me or would just brush it off. To be honest, my mother wasn't the greatest parent, but even our little German Shepherd puppy didn't like her either. He would bark and growl at her every time that she came out of the room. My mom's boyfriend hated the barking and would argue with my mom about it. The fights got so bad that he eventually said that either the dog goes or we all go. My mom gave the dog away, and I remember my sister and me crying as we said goodbye to Shiloh. One day we didn't see the old lady at all again though, and I asked my sister where she was, and she just shrugged and said maybe she doesn't feel like playing today, and then went back to playing leapfrog. I was happy not to see her that day. That night, everyone went to bed as usual, but I woke up in the middle of the night because I needed to use the bathroom. The bathroom was right in front of the middle room, so I couldn't avoid passing by it. As I walked to the bathroom, I noticed the door to the middle room was slightly ajar with light spilling out into the hallway. I got that bad feeling again, but I still wanted to see what was inside. I peeked through the gap in the door, and what I saw will stay with me forever. The old lady was there, but her back was turned to me, and she was twitching in a strange, unnatural way, and her skin was gray like a corpse. She smelled terrible, like rotting flesh. I just stood there frozen when suddenly she turned her head toward me, her eyes completely black. Her face looked gray like it was decaying, and I cried and ran back to my room, diving under the covers and praying that she wouldn't come to the door. Thankfully, she didn't. I didn't sleep much that night, but eventually I dozed off when the sun came up. When I woke up, my sister wasn't in the room, so I cautiously walked out still pretty terrified. I found everybody sitting in the kitchen eating breakfast, but the old lady wasn't there. I ran to my mom and told her everything that I had seen. My mom's boyfriend gave her a look, and my mom looked angry and said, "What are you talking about?" I started crying and pointing to her boyfriend and said, "Your mom." My mom popped me on the arm and yelled at me to apologize. I cried and threw a tantrum because they didn't believe me. Every time I explained it all over again, my mom's boyfriend would get madder and madder, and finally he stood up, took me by my arm, and dragged me to the middle room and opened the door. The room was empty. There were old clothes, old jewelry, and old purses that looked to belong to an old lady. The room smelled of dust, like no one had been in it for a long time. He dragged me further into the room and pointed to a picture on top of the dresser. In the picture, it was the boyfriend's mom, but she looked younger. Her hair was black and she had an afro, and she was smiling. He said, "Look here. That's my mom. She died 15 years ago." I was so shocked and scared and started crying even more. So I was sent back to my room and put into timeout. No matter how many times I told that story, no one ever believed me. The nightmares started soon after, and almost every night, I dream of her standing at the edge of my bed laughing at me. Eventually, my mom and her boyfriend had a massive argument, and they broke up. We moved out and went to live with my grandma. Years later, when I was like 11 and my sister was 13, I asked her if she remembered the old lady, my mom's ex-boyfriend's mom. To my surprise, too, she said that she had never seen an old lady back then. She admitted that she had only played along because she figured that it was my imaginary friend or whatever. I did daydream a lot as a kid. I'll admit that. But still, even now, all these years later, I know what I saw. And to this day, still, no one believes me. I want to start by saying that I've had paranormal experiences almost my whole life, and I've been spooked, but I've never really been scared. I've had things such as doors opening and closing, lights turning on and off, and seeing people walk by, hearing footsteps down the halls, cabinets opening, and hearing voices. But that being said, I have absolutely no idea what happened on this night or even what to call it. Some background information I think is probably important. So this incident happened in early 2023. I was 21 and I was living with my mom and sister. Around February 2020, I got really into spiritual things such as crystals, tarot, and read a ton on witchcraft, but kind of lost interest in it. My room was a safe space. I always had a feeling that nothing bad or negative could get in, as I was always burning incense and things like that. But we also had 4 dogs, 2 cats, and my room was directly across from my mom's. My bed was set up against my wall under the window and access from my door. Also, my sister and her boyfriend have 2 dogs. One lived with us while the other stayed at his place. And this night they were both there, and my sister always has the door shut at night with her dogs in her room. My mom was over at her boyfriend's for the night as well, and my sister and her boyfriend sleep in their room when she's not home because it's colder in my mom's room all the time. So I woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. In the process of getting up, my boyfriend at the time also woke up. Down the hall was the bathroom, which always had a nightlight on, and as I was walking to the bathroom, I saw our childhood dog, Barkley, just sort of laying on the floor outside of the bathroom. I reached down and pet him for a minute before going to the bathroom. I walked out and pet him again and went back to my room. As I was walking back, I saw my mom's door was shut, so I left my door cracked in case Barkley tried to come and sleep in my room like he usually does. I got back into bed and me and my boyfriend talked for a minute when all of a sudden my door pushed open and my sister's boyfriend's dog, Luna, came into the room. She's an extremely energetic dog, so she jumped straight onto the bed and started jumping and licking both of us. I pushed her off and she just left the room, and I leaned off the bed and pushed the door shut more, but still cracked open, and you could still see a good amount of the light coming from the nightlight in the bathroom. I remember us both being confused and talking about how weird it was that she was locked up in my mom's room with my sister and her boyfriend, but didn't think too much about it. I'm not sure what time it was, but my blinds were open, so I knew that it was still dark. I was laying on my back and my boyfriend put his head on my chest facing my closet, and we were just talking. I remember just looking at my door as a black shadow figure was staring right back at me. It was just an outline with no facial features at all, and the way that it was positioned, it looked like somebody was just leaning over and peeking their head into the room. But as I'm staring at this figure, I'm telling myself that it could be the cats on the bathroom counter just casting a weird shadow, and I was waiting for my boyfriend to turn his head to the door and then ask him what he thought it was, since it so clearly looked like a person. I was probably staring at this thing for a solid minute when I felt my boyfriend turn his head to face the door. And as soon as he turned his head, the figure backed out of view. I gasped and shoved him off of me and shot straight up with my back against the wall, and I couldn't talk. I was absolutely horrified. I was hyperventilating, so I couldn't even talk, to be honest, but he started freaking out, asking me what's going on and what's wrong, and I finally was able to say that someone is in the hall. And after a few minutes, he went through the house and he confirmed that no one was there. I was freaked out, but what was even scarier was that I had him go into the hall and recreate it. He was 6'4", so he's not short by any means, but he barely reached where this figure was. This thing would have been at least 7 feet tall to lean into the doorway like that and still be near to the top of it. I calmed down a bit when I heard my sister's boyfriend's alarm go off in my mom's room, so I knew that it was around 6 a.m. I then shouted his name for him and my sister to come into my room. My door was now wide open, so when my mom's bedroom door opened, we were both confused to see Luna run into the room and jump on us for a second time. We were both just looking like, what the heck is going on? They both came into the room, and as soon as I started telling them what had happened from the beginning, my sister stopped me and said, "What are you talking about? Luna and Barkley have been in the room with us the whole time." I was so freaked out, asking everyone if I was sleeping and pinching myself, but I was awake. In the end, I ended up falling asleep when the sun came up, and I asked my boyfriend if he remembered what happened, and he said yes, so I know that I wasn't dreaming. I still have no idea what happened that night, too. I don't know if it was a bunch of paranormal stuff or if it was something else, but it was weird. I moved out of my mom's in February and gave away most of the spiritual stuff to a girl who comes into my work. I now live with my childhood best friend and her boyfriend about 30 minutes away from my mom's and have seen shadows 2 other times. We have weird stuff happen still, but we just say that it's her dad or grandpa since both their ashes are in the house, and that's just what we say. I was with a guy that I was talking to though, and we got into an argument. And he was hugging me in the dark on my bed once, and I could see shadows bouncing around my room behind him. It could have just been my eyes, I admit. But again, I pushed him off of me, and I couldn't talk and just had an awful feeling suddenly come over me. I saged our house the next day, and I have only ever had one other experience since then. What happened was there was a tall shadow standing outside of my doorway a few months ago, but I'm just telling myself that it was my friend's dad watching over the house. Truthfully, though, I don't know what I saw of any of these times, but I sure would love to hear other people's opinions on what this is and if I can do anything about it. If you're enjoying the stories so far, consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind later. Now let's move on with the video. I had a close, dear friend years ago. We went to high school together and instantly became close as we enjoyed the same. Well, everything pretty much, movies, games, activities, and so on. This friend had a beautiful cottage in Muskoka, which was about an hour and a bit from the area that we lived in. They would talk about it a bunch, saying how awesome it was to go there in the summer as it was right by a river and was perfect for swimming and paddleboarding and all that. They also said that it was kind of haunted, though. Just a passing comment about how it was spooky, how they'd hear things at night, how it was probably home to a ghost. They always said this jokingly like it was no big deal, so we'd usually laugh at the idea that their beautiful and pretty much newly built cottage was actually a ghost house. Fast forward a couple of years, and they invite me out to their cottage in October. The family was going up, and my friend asked if I could come with them. I was super excited to go because I'd never really been to Muskoka and knew how beautiful it could be, especially in the fall, and also how often my friend mentioned the fun that they'd have at that cottage. I want to now preface what comes next with the fact that I have never had any paranormal stuff happen to me ever. I don't disbelieve it and never have, but I've never been in a position where I'd feel like, okay, this is definitely paranormal stuff until this event. So we get to where the cottage is located in this small community called Matthiasville. As soon as we enter, I just get this weird feeling like a shadow had been cast over me. It was a beautiful sunny day with good vibes all the way up until we crossed the bridge that led into the community. The weather suddenly turned overcast, but it wasn't that. There was a heavy and weird energy there. We're driving along the riverside for some time, and I tell my friend about the energy feeling, to which they said, "Oh, I know. It's weird, right? Like heavy and things lighten up." However, when we arrive at the cottage, this place was absolutely beautiful. New build, 3 floors, big deck on the 2nd floor, and tons of windows that went floor to ceiling. It overlooked the river, and it had a forest trail at the back even. The trail was way too thick with brush and would to even try to navigate, so we spent a lot of our time out by the water and on the big deck just sort of chilling. We drive into the nearest town, Bracebridge, for some outings, and at night we dedicated our time to beating the COD World at War campaign, split screen. It was an absolute blast. We went for a long day walk too, and saw some of the interesting points of Matthiasville, a big dam, and beyond that, a strange and small sort of graveyard that was situated on a slight hill at the very tip end of the community. All the graves were pretty old, and some of them were unmarked. Others, you couldn't even make out what the stones had written on them. It was eerie, but nothing out of the ordinary happened for the first 2 nights that we spent there, so I just thought that it was all a nothing burger. Now, on the third and last night, the dad had to head home early for some work stuff, so it was just my friend, their mom, and myself hanging out for the night. The mom was sleeping in the loft way up on the third floor, and we made the basement floor our home for the weekend. We decided to watch a movie and eat some snacks, but when that was finished, I suggested that we go out for a night walk since it was a clear night with a big moon out, and I love going for night strolls. Plus, we hadn't really been out and about after dark, and the place was pretty beautiful at night too. My friend, though, was really against this. They said that the place was spooky enough during the day, let alone at night. But I managed to convince them, and so how we went. We were walking along the road that went along the river towards the dam and the end of the community where the graveyard was. We made it about a quarter of the way when my friends stopped dead in their tracks. I looked back to see what was up, and they were just sort of standing there, and they looked defensive. I asked what was up, and they said, "We need to go back like now. This feels weird, and I don't like it at all." I asked if they were scared, like if they heard an animal or something. And as soon as I asked that, we heard what I can only describe as a deep and loud crackling and snapping of wood in the dense forest above us on a rocky ridge that was beside the road, opposite side of the river. I looked up to where we heard it, and it suddenly felt like everything just hushed. Crickets and all other nighttime sounds seemed to have just completely stopped. My friend quietly said my name. I looked back at them, and then suddenly, the bushes and the shrubs underneath the ridge on the other side of the road just exploded as if something huge jumped in them and thrashed around. This made us bolt, and I remember just saying run as I followed behind my friend. We ran non-stop straight to the basement door of the cottage. We got there in minutes, but it felt like seconds. We ran straight into the basement bedroom, and we both hopped into the bed. I remember saying that it was likely a coyote or a raccoon or something. But as soon as I said those words, a creaking started forming up above us in the living area of the first floor. The creaking soon turned into slow, heavy footsteps back and forth and loud as if someone was wearing work boots or something. I remember my friend through tears saying, "Does that sound like a coyote to you?" I cannot even describe the absolute feeling of dread that just suddenly washed over me, like there was something up there taunting us. We lay in complete silence for what felt like hours. We got into the bed at around 3 a.m. after our walk, which turned into a run, and the footsteps didn't stop for an hour or so at least. Eventually, I remember finally falling asleep at about 6 in the morning. When we woke up, the first thing that we did, of course, was ask the mom if she had been awake last night at around 3 a.m., and she assured us that she wasn't. She hadn't even gotten up once to use the bathroom, she said. Even if she did, we should have been able to have heard her door open and then the footsteps down the loft stairs. I mean, everything was open concept on the first floor, so it was easy to hear things going on there. After that, though, we packed up and left, and my friend's parents sold the cottage a couple of years later. And I don't think any of them went back once after that weekend. I was curious about the area afterward, though, so I eventually did some Googling and learned that it was once a sawmill or something like that, and a tragic accident happened there. I believe the owner's son drowned or had a bad accident in the mill or something tragic like that. I want to say that that could be a factor here, but honestly, who knows? All I know is that night I heard heavy, clear, and loud footsteps pacing around above us on the first floor. And that was my first and only paranormal experience that I will never ever forget. It was September in central Idaho. Autumn had come to the mountains, and with it bow hunters looking for mountain goats. My cousin, Vern, is an avid hunter. He's been all over North America hunting various game, bears in Alaska, wild dogs in Texas, bighorn sheep in Wyoming. But his favorite hunting area was the Lemhi Mountain Range in central Idaho. Our extended family has been hunting in those mountains for generations. We know every river bottom and mountain peak like many people know their own neighborhoods. Mountain goats are a fascinating animal to hunt. They live well above the tree line in rocky environments. They are sure-footed and can climb near vertical slopes. Hunting these animals requires one to venture into these dangerous areas too. And you have to be mindful as you pursue an animal like that. One wrong step on a rocky slope or one loose rock could mean that you're not going home ever again. Vern was an expert mountain hunter. It's something that I think that he was born to do. Now Vern decided to hunt in the Hayden River area. It's a familiar spot to most locals, and the area is home to plenty of mountain goats. The first mile of Vern's hike was uneventful as he climbed up the canyon. The air was crisp, and his breath formed in great plumes as he progressed. The sun was just peeking over the mountains when Vern came to a small deer trail. He decided that it might be a nice shortcut from his usual route and took it. A few hundred feet up the trail, he saw something odd pop out from behind a tree, though. It was a man. He was dressed in a light denim coat and jeans and was carrying a small backpack. My cousin stopped for a second to get his bearings, unsure of where this guy came from. The man waved at him with both arms. One of them was holding an older-style hunting bow. And acknowledging him, Vern waved back. Although the man looked to be physically fine, it was clear that he was emotionally distressed. He yelled out something my cousin couldn't quite hear and waved his arm, indicating that my cousin should follow him. Vern didn't get any bad vibes from this guy and could tell that he was genuinely in need of some help. He began to make his way up the canyon following this mystery man. Vern could never gain any ground on this guy, though. He was always just far enough away that he couldn't really talk to him. Periodically, the man would stop, turn towards him to make sure Vern was still following him. Every time that he looked back, Vern could see the worry in his face. My cousin did his best to remain calm and keep a smile on his face, unsure who or what he was being led to. It was peculiar, Vern thought as he hiked. He hadn't seen any other vehicles on his drive up to the trailhead. Perhaps he came in from another ridge or something. What could he possibly be leading him to, though? He figured one of his hunting party had been hurt and needed help. Of course, he wouldn't have had to speculate if the man would just stop and talk to him for 5 minutes. Vern, though, lost sight of the guy, just past a turn in the trail. The trail opened up into an incredibly steep rocky talus slope. He looked in every direction, and he couldn't locate the man when he heard a whistle. Looking up, he saw the guy about 500 feet up the rocky slope, waving at him. There was just no possible way that he could have gotten up that far in just the short time that Vern lost sight of him. Mind you, he still didn't feel any fear or wariness about the weird situation. The man was waving more frantically now, practically begging Vern to follow him up the slope. With a sigh and a grunt, he started up the rocks. It was slow going. Every other step caused a mini rock slide and could cause him to continually lose his footing. Huffing and puffing on the cool, thin air, my cousin eventually made it to a small landing. It had taken him almost 45 minutes to get to that spot where he saw the man from below. There was no earthly way that anyone could have done that scramble up that hill any faster. Totally exhausted, though, and out of breath, Vern sat down on the stone landing. He looked around and couldn't see the man anywhere at this point. As he scanned his surroundings, he saw something odd poking out of the boulder about 20 feet away from him. Walking over to it, he found a weathered boot, 2 boots actually. Inside of those boots and under the boulder as well were bones. Vern looked around once again for the man, but he never did see him again. Weirdly enough, instead of feeling eerie or unnerving, Vern felt a sense of relief wash over him. He speculates that these emotions were not his own. What he felt seemed to have come from all around him. He marked the spot with his GPS, and he decided to make his way down and call the authorities. The county sheriff's office responded, and he led them up the canyon to the body. It took 4 grown men to push the boulder out of the way. And when they did, they found the skeletonized remains of a man. On the body, they found hunting equipment and some personal effects. From a credit card in the wallet, they were able to identify the man. He was a bow hunter that had gone missing almost exactly 53 years beforehand. Vern never wanted to be identified to the public or the missing hunter's family. He didn't want any recognition for something like that. To him, It was just one of those bizarre mountain stories that you hear from time to time. He was happy that the family got closure, even if it was half a century later. The only thing that bothered him, though, was the man leading him up the canyon, and with his strange and sudden disappearance like that. He had mentioned the waving man to the sheriff, but was brushed off. When news reports came out announcing the discovery, several photos of the man were published, and Vern was absolutely shocked when he saw them. In the photos was the man that he had seen leading him up the mountain to the body. It finally made sense to him, the man's distressful look, the constant checking if Vern was following him, the sense of relief that he felt when the body was discovered. That man was desperate to get home. And through Vern, he was able to be reunited with his family. I would like to preface this by stating that the following is not creative writing by any means. This is a story that I was originally told secondhand by my mother, but confirmed by my grandfather when I was about maybe 14 to 15. I'll leave it to you to form your own opinion, obviously, or to debunk it or whatever. Regardless, this story has always stuck with me my whole life. So a bit of background. My grandfather passed away back in February 2013 from cancer, but in his lifetime, he was a decent guy who helped a lot of people in various ways. After he met my grandmother, they both joined the Army, and they served in Japanese-based U.S. Army hospitals during the Vietnam conflict, helping to save a lot of people. After his time with the Army, he also joined the Air Force for a stint. This all helped him to get his nursing degree and became an anesthesiologist. After the Air Force, he became a clergyman at their church, and years later, he would become a Russian Orthodox priest. For over 40 years, he served as a priest too. And by the way, just for reference, in most sects of Orthodox Christianity, they allow clergy to marry unless they were a bishop or higher. My grandfather, though, was the sort of priest that the archdiocese would call up and say, "Father, we have these people in Alabama. They're believers, but they have no church in like 100 miles that they can attend. Will you go there and help organize something?" Then what would start as people holding liturgy in somebody else's living room with like 24 people will become a full-on church eventually. He repeated that more times than I've ever gotten a straight answer on, by the way. The only thing that I thought that he was not so great for was always putting the church before his wife and 3 kids. Anyway, it was the mid-70s, and my grandfather had moved my mom, my aunt, and my grandmother to New Jersey to help one of these struggling churches that were without a priest. My mom, she was about 5 or 6 at that time, and she remembers this point in time pretty well too. One day, my grandfather was contacted by his bishop, who told him that his assistance was needed with something very serious. He told my grandfather that there is this young girl, 17 years old. She's a gypsy, and her family brought her to the monastery claiming that she was apparently possessed. The monks there tell me that they believe this to be serious too. Will you go there to help them? Now, my grandfather had been a priest for several years by that point, but understand that most priests who serve their entire lives are never asked to help exorcise a demon. Actually, the Roman Catholics require special permission from the Vatican to perform any exorcism rites, but he agreed without knowing what he was walking into. The story that I was told about the girl was that her name was Juliana, and her family were gypsies or travelers. She had come from a family that was heavily involved in occult practices, which shouldn't surprise anyone familiar with that culture. But Juliana was married to a man from another family in their clan. I don't know much about him besides that he was a bit older than her, and he also practiced a lot of magic. Juliana's family started becoming concerned when she started acting different. She was very moody, aggressive, wrathful in fact, and just straight up mean. As time went on, her fits would get worse and she would scream hurtful things at people for being asked simple things. But the family was terrified when the caravan that they lived in would rattle, rise up off the ground a few feet, and drop to the ground, and even on many occasions seeing things fly off the wall or out of cupboards and break against the wall. They obviously tried their own rites and rituals to cleanse whatever darkness they believed was possessing Juliana, but nothing had worked. So that's when they turned to this monastery, desperately seeking help. And this is where Grandpa gets involved. He said that when he got there, everyone was in the church. Another priest and a handful of monks, all preparing holy water oils, saying prayers for help with God's strength. In the back of the church were several curious lay people that live and help work on the monastery grounds, and then there were a bunch of Juliana's family. I guess they had her in a room with a few family members until they were ready, but they bring her in, sit her on a chair in front of the altar, and this is where my grandfather said that he felt the air get thicker, and she seemed really ticked off and was just sort of talking nothing, laughing and spitting, trying to scratch and kick. They had a few people restraining her as she started getting violent. They semi-surround her, and they began praying and performing the full-on exorcism rite. As they progressed, she began growling, and this was when he said that things started happening. The chairs in the church, they began rattling and shaking, then moving on their own before levitating off of the floor. Those curious people, and even some of Juliana's family, were so scared that they ran out of the church. He said that they continued praying and repeating the prayers over and over for several hours as things continued to erratically move on their own, and Juliana continued to curse them and their God, spit and scratch and target each person, and try to get into their head and break their concentration. But they continued praying and asking God and every saint that they could think of to help them banish this thing back to where it had come from and to leave this girl alone. Then she suddenly sat back rigidly and swung her head back. Then her face began to contort and take on this inhuman shape, while her mouth opened wider than a human's mouth could really expand without completely separating the jawbone, that is. And then a voice came from within her, and in this deep, growly, sort of loud, demonic voice said, "Leave me alone." I'm happy with her. But this voice, it didn't speak in English or in any other commonly spoken language. It spoke in a bit of a dead language that is native to the region of Romania and the steppes of Russia. It was a Slavic language. The monks knew this language, though, because many old church manuscripts are written in this nearly ancient language. This moment, though, it frightened everyone in the room, but they knew that they couldn't stop now. Not long after, though, Juliana, she passed out. She was unconscious, and they couldn't wake her for a moment. She was breathing, but she was definitely in rough shape. So they brought her to the hospital at this point, and she was stable, but wouldn't wake up. And then she was under for about 2 weeks. She woke up one day, and she was really confused. She didn't understand why she was in the hospital. She had no memory of the exorcism at all. In fact, she couldn't remember the last year and a half of her life. The very last thing that she could remember was being in her trailer. She said, "I was sitting at the table while my husband slept in our bed when I noticed something from the corner of my eye. I turned and I see my husband sleeping on his back, but there was this black cloud that was flowing out of his mouth and hovering above him in bed. And before I could scream, this black cloud rushed at me, and well, now I'm here. I think my grandfather was changed forever after that night." My mom tells me that she was 7 or so at the time, and she remembers that her father didn't speak for at least a couple of weeks, and he wore this sort of somber look on his face. He would move on eventually, but it definitely had a lasting impression. My mom says that he didn't tell her the story until she was a teenager. He was trying to warn her off of dabbling in the occult, as you never know what you're inviting in. My grandfather, he wasn't the kind of guy that liked to make up stories at all. Actually, he liked to call people out for embellishment a lot. He usually didn't have a lot to say too, unless you asked him about something. He was a very intelligent man, though, and read a lot. He also traveled across the U.S. and had been to various countries over his lifetime. He served in 2 branches of the military and had a career as a medical professional. I'd say that he has some level of credibility at least. In spite of the fact, too, that I come from a religious family and growing up, I went to church pretty regularly. I am not a religious person by any means. I've studied a good number of various belief systems, and I don't subscribe to any single one. So this isn't like a Christian rant or trash talking gypsies or whatever. I actually have a lot of respect for their heritage, but I just wanted to share a paranormal story that would never be heard if it wasn't for this platform. And so I now hand it over to you guys for any comments, questions, opinions, theories, and also any well thought out jokes. For years ago, I trained a new worker who was honestly a nice guy at the time, early 30s, seemingly healthy, very much into yoga, and had a beautiful girlfriend, etc. He seemed very balanced and healthy, to be honest. For the sake of this narrative, I'll name him Coworker A. So we had another longtime coworker who was sort of Mr. Popular with managers, but honestly super annoying. A really large personality. People mutually could only take him in small doses. He was essentially the embodiment of a TikTok frat boy who would randomly dance on the job and freestyle, and extremely annoying. But anyway, I'll call him Coworker B. Now before I explain, I should include that this workplace sucks. It barely holds a single star on Indeed. It's a large factory with no windows, toxic management, long hours, and it was very hard on most people's mental health. Anyway, roughly a year into Coworker's stay, things started changing. He and I were mutually friendly to one another. We would have long civilized discussions about interesting things, but something was really out of place when he mentioned that his new beliefs about the world being flat and a hologram moon theory or something. It was really unlike the old version of him who was super rational, but I sort of shrugged it off and said it's probably just a phase or he's trolling or something. Fast forward a few weeks and Coworker has seemingly took a lot of interest in Coworker B and sort of developed some of his mannerisms, but in a more endearing way, I guess kind of copying his silly dances and laughing. Seemed harmless at the time, but as months go past, he continued to dance more and more to the point that he had to be asked to stop by supervisors. He would even be moving around at the morning meetings using all the same mannerisms and phrases as Coworker B. This really started to creep out Coworker B a bit to the point that he actually switched shifts, and we theorized that maybe he was on drugs. But Coworker was very vocal against all substance use, including alcohol and weed. He was also a vegan, so I don't know. That just didn't fit. Where things change for the worse, though, is when Coworker B ends up getting with a new hire at work. She ends up becoming his girlfriend, and they move in together. This is when Coworker shows up to work using Coworker B's name, even signing himself in on the logbook as him, referring to himself as B all morning. Then later that day, stands up on a work table screaming, "I'm in love with Coworker B's girlfriend by name," with his arms spread out in a cross like Jesus formation, face to the ceiling, and the whole place just went silent. And after he ended up standing in a corner with a broom sweeping nothing for the next several hours, he wouldn't turn around from the corner either, not even when tapped on the shoulder or called by name. The only time that I saw him away from that corner was when it was time to go home. He was the last one out, and unfortunately my job being QC, I'm always among the last ones out as well. Despite both of us being the last in the building, I did my best to act normal when passing him in the hallway. I glanced at him. He was looking directly at me, head tilted down, making a sort of pseudo-snarling dog face, eyebrows in AV, tongue, and teeth out. The next day, though, our boss decided Coworker needed to go to the hospital, so we actually made an appointment and got him in with an Uber. He was put on leave for a week as well. The security guards who I was friends with told me that I was showing up in the middle of the night trying to sign in for work at the card reader apparently, sometimes at 2 or 3 in the morning. Anyway, surprisingly, a week later, Coworker comes back and seems somewhat normal, almost like he has no recollection of anything that he did. He even wrote an entire album on his phone apparently in that time, which surprisingly was better than I thought that it would be. But I noticed that it was all like love lyrics, sort of like country love songs. As things seemed to normalize with Coworker, he stated that he really wanted to hang out with me, go for a hike, and throw axes at trees, etc. I sort of didn't agree or disagree, and told him that I'd get back to him on that as I secretly was a little on edge. He asked me later that day if I was still down, and I said unfortunately I had other obligations. He said, "Well, I guess I can't throw an axe at your face then." And I sort of laughed, not really knowing how to react to that at all. I told a manager about that though, and he kind of just scratched his head uncomfortably and shrugged his shoulders. Anyway, Coworker ends up finding Coworker B's address due to a work get-together where everyone was invited and someone leaked it to Coworker A. They eventually find rocks and bricks and weird formations on their doorstep like shrines almost, and we all collectively knew that it was definitely a Things got really weird though when they actually found him looking through their windows at night. He was also scratching the windows with his nails, calling out B's name, repeatedly whispering, "B, I need to tell you something." This is when our manager finally decided to take action and agreed to fire A. And 4 years later, coworker still stalks coworker B's now ex-girlfriend who had to get a restraining order against him. He annually makes new Facebook accounts and adds all 200 plus workers who used to work there as the place got shut down. He uses a new name each time with a different selfie. He sends a message to each one of us as well saying, "Hey you, it's a B from work." So I guess my question is, what would this behavior be called? And how did such a normal, likable, level-headed person turn into this? Is there a term for this behavior? What would your diagnosis be? How do I keep myself and other people safe? One of my friends had the balls to actually ask him in a reply if he recalls anything, which apparently he doesn't. But he sure remembers B's ex-girlfriend and says some extremely concerning things about how she's the one and the only one. I'm the bigger one and she's the smaller one. He was put on this earth essentially to save her, apparently. He also seemingly has no support at all from family or anything and is working a new job and living alone unattended. I feel like this is sort of a risk. Yeah. Anyway, I'm interested in some of your feedback about what he might be dealing with. And again, what do I do about this? I want to talk about this because no one in my family likes to discuss this because they say it feels too negative and like something bad will happen. Basically, I was home alone with my daughter. My husband works night shift, and it was maybe 1 in the morning, so he was at work. My daughter was asleep in bed next to me, and I decided to turn my phone off and go to bed. And as I started to settle, I heard my dog jump up, and then it sounded like she was getting attention from someone, so I opened my eyes and saw my husband bend over petting her. Now my husband works in a warehouse and wears a very bright reflective vest. At first, my heart dropped because I knew no one should be there. Then I saw his vest, and I thought that it was him. The only problem was that something felt very wrong, and I knew that he shouldn't be home yet. I stared at him, and he looked up and smiled at me. I'm not sure when I fully realized, but I knew that this was not my husband. He was at work. So I shut my eyes tight and refused to open them. I felt hands moving in my legs all of a sudden, and once it reached my thighs, the hands were suddenly gone, and my daughter woke up screaming. Motherly instincts kicked in, and helping my daughter was far more important than hiding from whatever this was. So I jumped up and grabbed my phone as fast as I could. I shone the light around and tried to console my daughter, and all she kept saying was "Daddy, no," over and over again. And while screaming this, I suddenly realized that we were home alone. This has never happened before or afterward, and really, I don't know what this thing was or what it wanted. But I found this place, and I wanted to share my story. I'm also going to add that I've been asked if this could be sleep paralysis, and in my opinion, I really don't think it was. The timing is questionable. I'll admit it, but I definitely felt like I was awake. And I don't know, with sleep paralysis, aren't you supposed to be asleep? I don't think that this falls under that category, and I'm sorry I can't give more information, but this is all that happened. I was your typical kid growing up in a lower to middle class household. We had a decent older house in the suburbs, and Mom and Dad were always working. This was the 80s, so my brother and I were often home alone or over at a friend's house. Our parents, they were pretty negligent in many ways, but this is also sort of how things just were back then. Now I remember knowing something was deeply, deeply wrong with our home as early as I could form memories or sense the world around me. I was afraid of ghosts and monsters under the bed or in my closet like every other kid. You know, things that obviously weren't real and just some primal monkey brain remnant that kids work through as they get older. But there was a distinct difference between these imagined monsters and the very real ones that I would encounter over the next few years. My mother's father was still alive when this all started. He bought me a blue and white fighter jet, which I hung from the ceiling in my bedroom above my bed. Sometimes wind would come in through the window and turn it a few spins counterclockwise, then it would spin clock and come back to rest and be still. I remember observing just how it would eventually come to rest. It never spun much, but I like to imagine it screaming through the sky and sort of pew-pewing all over the place. Shortly after I installed this thing, I would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night for no reason. I wasn't scared or startled or really awake for any reason. I would stare up at the ceiling trying to go back to sleep. Every once in a while, the jet would spin and spin and spin faster and faster until it was a blur all in the same direction. The first time it happened, I thought that it was really weird. By the fifth or sixth time, this became genuinely a terrifying event. Other times, it would be spinning at warp speed and suddenly just stop abruptly as if someone had grabbed it and held it in place. I have a memory of running out of my room screaming and crying over this. Grandpa, he died the next year. That jet meant more to me than it did before, obviously. I cherished this little treasure, but it was terrorizing me, and eventually I just had to get rid of it. I was in first grade and walking to and from school with my friends. I had a house key, which wasn't unusual at the time. Downstairs, we had a living room with a TV and a couch. I remember coming home one of these days to watch cartoons. On my left side, there were slotted folding doors that hid the clothes washer and dryer. They always spooked me out for some reason, like there was someone in there sometimes sitting there just watching me. I never saw anyone or heard anything, but I could just never shake that feeling. In fact, I would often run by them. They were a source of fear for me, but I was already taking my own clothes out and putting them away, so it wasn't alien or unusual. It just very often felt like someone was behind there, just sort of watching me. I think I was actually watching Pinwheel or something similar on TV, maybe Lamp Chop. I don't know. But I remember sitting there once and the left door folded open abruptly, like someone tied a rope to it in a car outside and the car just suddenly took off. They weren't on wheels or anything, so this scared the daylights out of me. I cried to my parents about it. I was being a baby apparently, and it was nothing though until it wasn't. You see, one day I was sitting there and it opened and shut like this over and over, just slamming. I wanted to run by to get out, but it wasn't safe because something kept slamming it open and slamming it shut. I almost want to say I heard laughter, but I don't know. I don't think I did. I was being terrorized though, and it stopped. And as I ran by it, it started up again, and it scared me half to death. I slammed the door behind me and instantly just ran upstairs. Things calmed down for a few months after that. I was in the second grade, Mrs. Tubman's homeroom. I'm a big boy now, and I don't get scared or pee in the bed over ghosts that aren't real anymore. I'm helping my older brother with yard work and delivering papers now. I'm quickly becoming fiercely independent at a young age. I get my own key and start walking home alone from school even. Now we had a Raggedy Ann doll that sat on a rocking chair in one of the adjacent bedrooms. It always creeped me out, especially because it used to be in the attic where I'd see it every time that we got Christmas ornaments out. For some reason too, my parents, they brought it down and set it downstairs on this rocking chair. I came home one day to watch cartoons, and as I go to reach for the handle leading to the basement, the doorknob suddenly spins. Someone is on the other side holding it closed. Naturally, it must be my brother. He got out earlier than me, of course, and he was playing a trick. I tried opening the door, but it just wouldn't budge. It was unlocked or the knob wouldn't turn, so I pushed my shoulder into it because I knew I was stronger than him, but it still didn't open. I moved back to get some speed behind me and go to shoulder it again, but the door slowly opens as I'm about to hit it. In fact, I fly through the open door and stumble into the room with that doll sitting there instead. And to my abject horror, the rocking chair is moving back and forth. The doll is just a doll, obviously, but it was as if a person was sitting there. I scream, run out, and I make it halfway up the stairs. I'm losing my mind. I mean, this can't be real. And in the end, my parents told me that it wasn't real and they made me go to the school counselor and coach me to swear that it wasn't real, that I was brave. I deliver newspapers and I do yard work. I'm a big boy, so it can't be real. I go back down eventually and peek my head around the corner. The doll is now sitting there facing me with its back against the arm, and the chair is still rocking at the same mathematical, rhythmic, and predictable speed. It's just the wind, though, I say. My parents had told me this. But when I look at the windows, they were closed. At this, I completely lose it. I run out, make it up half of the stairs to the front door landing. I got up the other half of the stairs to the kitchen. I look around, but there's nothing. No one is home. It's just me, and I'm just freaking out. Mom convinced me that I made these up and none of this was real. I try to pull myself together. We can't afford for them to come home early from work, so I come down, get my head straight, and pour myself a glass of water. And that was when I hear the bang. 2 bangs. Stay safe out there, everyone, and never be afraid to ask for help. 3, 4, and 5. It is the unmistakable sound of the attic door. You pull a cord and the stairs fall out and down, and you climb up the hole in the ceiling, except you can slightly pull it to a certain length and let the cord go, and it will still slam. I know too exactly what it is and why it is making that noise, but I just cannot believe it. So I peek my head around a corner, and I see the rope is taut. It's straight down to the floor like someone is pulling it. It wasn't swaying or dangling as the attic opens and slams. There's something invisible there pulling it and doing this on purpose. I completely lose my mind over this, and I run to the neighbor's house. I tell them Mom and Dad come home early. I get in trouble. I have to see another school counselor, Tim, I think this time, but he had soft curly black hair and he's pleasant enough, but my parents tell me to tell him that it's not real. I refuse, though. I see a Dr. Glickstein at some fancy office downtown. I tell him everything that I've told you guys up to this point. I have to see him a few more times. Eventually, my mother convinces him, though, that I'm just making up stories. The terror campaigns, though, they continue for another whole year. It is mischievous, evil, persistent little things that crescendo into big things that become aggressive and threatening, like it was messing with me. I'm 7 now, and one day I get really sick, like very sick. So sick another family member has to come over and watch me. I'm laying in bed with a window fan in, and I'm on the cusp of sleeping. I'm praying to God and asking Grandpa for help, and I just can't do this anymore when I see a little golden tornado-looking thing come in from the outside through the window fan into my floor. It's in the corner of my eye, but I'm frozen in terror because, what now? Right? But I suddenly just sort of feel peaceful. The corners of my sheet get tugged on, and I almost lose it, but I realize they're getting tucked into the side of the bed. I feel a warm sort of soft hand like my grandfather's press on the small of my back. I'm suddenly no longer terrified. In fact, I'm sort of serene and never been more at peace. I crack an eye open, and I see that it's now 1 a.m. Everything settles, and I'm calm, and not only do I feel better emotionally, but my illness even feels a whole lot better. A refreshing, rejuvenating breeze comes into the room, and it carries me off to sleep. At night, I sleep really peacefully too. I wake up the next morning. My family member is frying eggs, and the house is the brightest that it's ever been. It's like a Disney movie with animated birds outside singing. The food is fresh. The world is bright and new. Every family member is happy, and even my brother is in good spirits. It seems like an entirely different world. We are eating breakfast, and I thank the family member for tucking me in so late last night. She then says, "Well, that's strange. I went to bed after tucking you in at like 8 p.m. and slept through the night." This confused me for years, and it took me a while, but I realized that after that night, I was never bothered again. No more slamming doors, weird dolls, slamming attics, laundry room door harassment. Nothing. Gone. Just like it never existed at all. I go on to forget about this until February 2015 when that family member died, and I guess again up until now. I really still don't know what to make of a lot of it or how to feel about it. I know it sounds kind of wild and sorry for that, but I think that there was some type of spiritual intervention that put an end to the haunting, I guess. I sometimes think Grandpa did me one last solid and came to help me. I am not very religious at all, but I just cannot shake the feeling that this is exactly what happened. I know it sounds wild, but I mean, really, I've racked my brain over it endlessly, and really, what could it be? I inevitably burned that raggedy doll outside with my brother, who seemed to be the only one who ever believed me. By that point, it was emotional closure, and not like destroying a spiritual vessel or cursed object. But after that night, I just never experienced anything again. I grew up to be just a normal person. I've never since had any auditory or visual hallucinations or anything. I'm convinced to this day that all of this was very real, though. I find it hard to believe any of this ever happened in my head despite what my parents and teachers said. And in the end, I think some type of guardian spirit stepped in and put an end to it when I asked for help. And quite honestly, I'm just not sure that there's really any other way to see this for me. In any case, thanks for listening, and more importantly, thanks for giving me this safe place to share this. You can only be gaslit and over real events so many times until it becomes a bit of a sore spot. Thanks for watching. If these stories kept you on edge, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next chilling tale. See you in the next video.